The Able to Care podcast is sponsored by Able Training Support Limited, who build partnerships with organisations to develop confidence and competence in their team to promote positive outcomes for all. Find the link in the description. Hello and welcome to the Able to Care podcast. I am your host, Andy Baker. And on this week's episode, I'm excited to be able to share a couple of books with you that I've been reading that I thought people watching, listening might find interesting and useful. So the two books have been sent around sensory processing. So sensory processing is something that I'm quite passionate about. I'm really fascinated by it. I think whether it goes back to my own old love of biology a little bit or wherever it comes from, but I find the sensory system and the way that we process the world really, really interesting. And I know that some of you may be aware, if you know our back catalogue a little bit, we've got some really interesting podcast episodes talking about sensory processing in the kind of two extremes, one being in elderly care and dementia care. So this is where I've encountered challenges and difficulties with sensory integration and sensory processing. And on the other side, we've got those on the autistic spectrum and children who may also struggle and have difficulties or differences in their sensory processing abilities. So I find it's one of those things that affects, well, people universally to some degree or another. You know, we are sensory processing machines, essentially, that the majority of our brain is involved in processing sensory information to navigate the world, to understand the world and things like that. So I find it a fascinating subject, but I think it is such an important subject to have a better knowledge of when we are working in care across the board. Because I think particularly for those, for instance, on the autistic spectrum, that statistically, about 90% of those on the autistic spectrum have some degree of sensory processing difference or difficulty. And it is probably impacts on their lives more than the typical things that people think about around autism as far as the differences in social interaction and communication. Because they can kind of work around that, but the sensory processing can become extremely overwhelming. And when we kind of involve or come across kind of the meltdowns or the emotional dysregulation, a lot of that could be sensory caused, although it may be challenges with communication at times, okay? On the other end of the spectrum, this whole new way your brain is processing information in the elderly care setting also changes their reactions to situations, their interpretation of situations. So for me, it is fundamental to understand the senses if you work in care. That's the way I look at it. So the two books that I came across from an author called Monique Thoonsen. So Monique is Dutch. She's written 4 books around the subject, an expert in that subject. 2 of them have been translated into English. One of them she also wrote with a teacher as well, a lady called Carmen Lamp. And I like them. They're really, really good. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about them. We'll try and provide some links and things like that as far as being able to find these books. So the first one is called Sensory Solutions in the Classroom. It's obviously aimed for teachers predominantly. But the reason I kind of got it, one, obviously I'm always looking to expand. I do a lot of professional development because I'm teaching in lots of different sectors. So I try and make sure that I'm able to understand how it affects individuals in different settings. So obviously within a home is going to be different from at school. So I want to understand as much about how those two environments can work together as much as possible as well. What I like about the book, it's very accessible. Although there is some quite complex subject matter in there and it does break down the information in the brain, similar to the way I like to do things, they've used a lot of metaphors as far as understanding. So one of the metaphors in there, for instance, they use the metaphor of a bouncer, so like a doorman in a pub. And a long time ago in a previous life, I used to work in the pub industry and do that kind of thing. So I find that quite relatable. And what it was referring to is that the bouncer acts like a gateway to the senses. So the things that we naturally process or the information coming through our senses, it prioritizes who comes into the club, a bit like our brain prioritizes what sensory information comes to our brain or that becomes part of our conscious thought or our reactions. So it refers to what we call the VIP, and the VIP is the very important stuff. So things like our brain is very quick to react to, let's say, a wasp landing on our skin, for instance, or a siren going off, or something that could mean danger or let us know that something is unsafe for us in the environment. So the VIPs, they get it in first. The next thing is the stuff that's interesting. Okay, so the interesting stuff is stuff that we want to pay attention to, that we're kind of almost choosing to, but these become automated processes in the brain where we're drawn to things that, well, we could obviously sort of say, when I've bought a new car, I start to notice that same car on the road. Now, it's not necessarily I'm interested, but my brain's kind of interested in it. It's spotting the similarities in the world around. So they're the interesting. Then we've got the kind of important, which is other stuff that I need to be prepared of. And it kind of gives a really nice breakdown of these different areas of why we use our senses, why they're important. Because I think we kind of underestimate that. We just kind of take them for granted a little bit. But the reason I know when I leave this room that I need to walk out the door and not the wall is because my brain and my senses tell me I can't walk through walls. If it wasn't for my senses, I wouldn't know that. I wouldn't be able to do that. I wouldn't learn from that. The other thing, an analogy they use in both the books that I'm going to be talking about as well, is they use a fan analogy. And the fan analogy is kind of where they are or where this individual is on the kind of the under-responsive to over-responsive to kind of overwhelm cycle. Okay. And it gives some really nice tools in there to kind of recognize this, following this kind of analogy of the fan, to where is this child in this moment? And do they need activating, as in their sensory system is slightly under-prepared or under-responsive, so they need activating? Or do they need calming in the fact that their sensory system is in overwhelm and therefore they need to regulate and need help to be able to regulate? So it's really quite a nice, it's a step-by-step process. It seems really like kind of analytical in the way they kind of give some tools. So as far as I'll show the book on those of you who are actually watching, Sensory Solutions in the Classroom. Okay, aside from the two authors, you'll see from the book itself, it breaks down into quite a lot of activities, quite a lot of it's nice and easy, accessible. It's not a hard read. It all looks at the 8 senses, which are most commonly associated with those. OTs is a system they tend to use around sensory processing. They tend to refer to the 8 senses. If you aren't familiar with the 8 senses, because some of you probably got taught at school that we only have 5, and you were lied to. There is way more than 5. There is theories out there that postulate 53 different senses that we have, but that does break it down into a significant breakdown. And obviously that would be a boring episode if I just start talking about all 53 different senses. So we tend to just refer to the 8. Sometimes there's 9 put in there. So most people know the 5, which is visual, auditory, tactile, olfactory, and gustatory. They're the 5 that we have that are what we call our public senses. But then we'll have our 3 private senses, which is your proprioception, knowing where your arms and legs are in the world, vestibular, which is your balance, and also then you've got your interoception, which is the information you gain from your organs, which tell you whether you are hungry or whether you're thirsty or whether you need the toilet, but they also tell you whether you're angry or whether you're upset. Okay, so these are all the information we get through. So they're the 8 different senses, 5 public and then the 3 private. Okay, so few bits that I like in here as far as the classroom is concerned. One, it starts off by giving a really good breakdown of what sensory processing is and what sensory processing difficulties are. And it uses some metaphors along the way, but it also gives a few bits as far as actual strategies in the classroom. So it's one, there's strategies in the classroom. So all teachers kind of know the child that kind of rocks on their chair or hides themselves in the hood and things like that. And it may be perceived they're not paying attention, but they're actually working really hard to actually be able to self-regulate, to be able to pay attention, to be able to learn. But it's counter to what we think paying attention is. When I'm teaching, I have loads of adults who will doodle, who'll swing, who'll look out the window, but then you ask them questions and they know the answer. They've found their ways of listening and self-regulating, but that's the problem. We allow an adult to do that. Some people don't allow children to do that, or they think not paying attention. So it gives a good breakdown, strategy in the classroom, strategy outside the classroom, but it also goes into some actual managing the environment. So one of the things that whenever I'm teaching around behavioral management, I always try and get people to think about the prevention, proactive and responsive. So don't wait until the meltdown occurs before you start trying to de-escalate. We should be putting things in place to try and prevent those from happening in the first place. And this book gives a really nice breakdown on that, as far as one, actually organizing the classroom itself, how we lay it out, the different strategies that we could use. It also gives them strategies, some tips for teaching methods that work better for sensory for kids with sensory difficulties. And then at the end, it gives a really nice kind of input of a step-by-step guide, loads of stuff around. And one thing I really think is important that I noticed in this book, there's a sort of chapter towards the end, which is about helping teachers and parents to interact with each other, which is he never does that when he's with me. And I thought this is one of the most common things that I have or encounter with a discrepancy between teachers and parents, or teachers and caregivers, is that caregivers are experiencing all of these things, or they're not, but then the teachers are saying, well, we don't get any of that. And it's just that simple thing. Well, of course, they're going to be different. We behave differently in different environments. I behave differently at work than I do at home. I behave differently in a restaurant than I do on my own meal table. So, of course, there's going to be different pressures, different stresses, different inhibitors in those different environments. I don't understand why that's hard. So suddenly you've got that case of, well, he doesn't do it when he's with me. Well, maybe there's a very different set of stressors, or maybe the inhibitors that are there mean that they don't feel they can act themselves or safe to act themselves. That doesn't mean that they're okay. It doesn't mean you're doing better. It doesn't mean that this place is better or worse. In fact, it could be the complete opposite to what you think. You know, it might be that, let's say, for instance, the classroom is highly sensory overwhelming, but we have an individual who's a sensory slumper, as in they are overstimulated, but they just kind of are passive. So they just kind of go, it's too much hard work, there's too much going on. So the cup is kind of spilling over, but they just don't do anything about it. They disassociate rather than going into fight or flight. So they have the freeze response rather than going into fight or flight. Well, for a teacher, it might be, well, he's very quiet. He doesn't really join in with much, but he's very well behaved and he just sits there and he does his, he gets on, he's okay. So they're not red flagging, they're not creating issues. But what's that kid going to do when he then gets home, when he then feels safe enough? Well, that's where we're going to get the fight or flight reaction occur as a result of that. So there's this really nice bit at the end of this book, which kind of gives that he doesn't do this when it's home, and looks at reasons why that might happen. And I thought that was a nice touch in the book. The second book from the same author, Monique, is called Making Sense of Your Senses. Okay, and this one's a little bit different because this is actually a workbook for children. One of the things I had in my household that I had to teach a child about sensory processing issues because another child in my household had sensory processing issues. So one of the things that happened was that this child kept making allegations. This younger lad kept going, he hit me. And the other lad was going, I didn't touch him, I barely touched him, and stuff like that. So who's telling the truth? What's going on? Now, is this lad kind of making allegations to get his brother in trouble? Is he making it up? Is he telling lies, fibs, stories, whatever it is, because he just wants to get his brother in trouble or whatever? Or is this lad actually hitting him? So we need to find that out, okay? So I watched, and what I noticed is that all this older lad did was basically place his hand on the young lad's shoulder. So the younger lad, we'll call him L. L had sensory processing difficulties. So just being touched triggered this flinch response, and he starts going, ow, you hit me, that hurt. Okay, now he barely touched him. I saw he barely touched him. So is that a case of, he's definitely lying. Look, he's trying to get his brother in trouble. But the pain reaction was real. The pain reaction was a genuine fight response, okay? Because we knew he had motor sensory difficulties, he struggled with his tactile and proprioception system. His brain was telling him that he'd been smacked. His brain was not able to tell the difference between a soft touch and a firm touch due to his tactile system's kind of either modulation or discrimination abilities, okay? So he wasn't lying. In his mind, the older lad had hit him, okay? So he wasn't lying, he wasn't making it up. The reason that didn't happen all the time, that somebody touched him didn't trigger that same reaction, is because what he would do is he'd managed to learn how to use his visual system to help to interpret movement. So my tactile system can tell the difference between a soft touch and a hard touch. I don't need to look at my hand or look at somebody else's hand to tell the difference between a soft touch and a hard touch. But if I couldn't do that with just purely my tactile system, I might, if I saw what the person was doing, I could see how fast the hand was traveling, what level of intent, maybe even facial expressions around the person, whether they were in a state of anger or whether they weren't. And that would then give me additional or more information about how the person was touching me, as far as whether it was a soft touch or a hard touch. So when this lad didn't see the touch coming, when he couldn't see what the hand was doing, his brain was interpreting it as a smack rather than a tap. So all I had to then teach this older lad was, look, he's not lying. He's not trying to get you in trouble. His brain works slightly differently. So when he doesn't see you coming, his brain tells him that you hit him, even though I know you didn't. So please, when you go to get his attention, when you go to call him for dinner, please just make sure he sees you. Show him that you're there. Step in front of him so he visually sees you. Don't surprise him with a touch to the shoulder, because that's what's triggering the he hit me response. Okay, so I could have really done with this book when I was in those circumstances and situations, because it's a kind of work through to help kids to understand their own senses. Now, obviously, it's really useful as far as somebody with sensory processing is concerned, but I think it's so important to educate kids generally about obviously differences, especially if there is differences in their household, like the example I just gave you there. So as far as making sense of your senses, it does go through each of the 8 senses that we've already spoken about, but it also kind of gives an opportunity for children to look at what they like, what they don't like, what works for them, what doesn't work for them. But it also looks at things like sensory diets and starts helping children to create sensory diets. So a sensory diet is essentially kind of it's like an exercise program for your sensory system, if you like. That's probably the best way of describing it. So rather than only going to the gym every now and again, which means you don't get stronger, it's trying to initiate a kind of a little and often program related to sensory input. So for instance, in the proprioception system, or the sensory motor system, which is made up of your movement and your tactile system and stuff like that, everything you do for movement. One thing if you are dysregulated with that, it may feel like you're not comfortable in your own skin, especially if you're under responsive, you get a lack of input. So you need more bang for your buck. You need more input going in. So general life doesn't give you enough. But by doing certain activities throughout the day, like every hour and a half to 2 hours, for instance, of, let's say, heavy work, for instance, like carrying something heavy or doing some kind of significant movement exercise, feeling like a significant sense of pressure, or even doing kind of press-ups against the wall or anything like that, where there's some kind of force exerted on me that's more significant than I just get from my day-to-day life, it might give me a top-up of feeling comfortable in my own skin, feeling more regulated for a good couple of hours, essentially. And then I need to top up again and top up again and top up again. So putting in things like sensory diets are a great way of helping a child to feel more regulated throughout the day. But it also helps them to develop their, what we call habituation, which is where we get used to something over a period of time. So it feels safer. Like the first bang you hear in a firework display makes you jump, but the second one, third one, fourth one doesn't, because your brain becomes habituated. It reacts to that first one, recognizes, hey, that's not dangerous. And therefore it kind of then goes, I don't need to react to that anymore. So by initiating it more often throughout the day, because some kids with sensory processing difficulties don't habituate in a typical way, they need more. They need to do it more often. They need more practice than others would. And if you just look at it as like practice, but also about helping them to re-regulate, it's a really useful strategy. So this book kind of helps you to create sensory diets for your kids, to give them a better chance of being able to self-regulate or reducing and preventing. So what you can do with kind of things like sensory input, for instance, you might go, this kid finds this particular thing really challenging, but they find this thing really regulating. So before we go into the challenging things, should we regulate them? Should we take a break partway through and allow them to regulate? Or do we need to make sure that we're regulating after the activity before they go into anything else? So whenever we're looking at kind of, this is something that, okay, we'll use the bottle of Coke, shakes up the bottle of Coke. Well, what can I do to settle it before I shake it? Maybe take a break and settle it midway, or what do I need to do after I've shaken it to try and stop it from blowing its lid? Big recommendation from both books. If you're interested in sensory processing, if you are either a teacher or a parent or a foster parent or working at a children's home, anybody where you think there might be a difference in your child's sensory processing, and it's hard to tell in the early stages, is it just a typical child under 7, or is there a sensory difference? And that's why a case of educate yourself, find out some strategies, start initiating some self-regulating behaviors. Because one thing I'd say is, most of us have some degree of sensory challenges, especially like when we're tired, for instance. We might be more likely to have sensory difficulties. So by initiating some or learning some strategies to kind of help improve the environment, creating processes, procedures throughout the day, hopefully we've got a better chance of these. And okay, last kind of final thought on this, the earlier we can instigate an improvement in sensory diets or start focusing on improving sensory processing strategies, the better the outcomes for the child. The later and later we leave it, the harder it is for overcome. Remember that very young brain, the plasticity is still there, very malleable, very moldable. So if we can kind of start taking action in the very early stages, then we've got a better chance of improving the outcomes long term. So they're my 2 recommendations. We'll make sure we put a link in the show notes, in the comments, somewhere so you can gain access to these 2 books. Hope you found that interesting. Hope you found that useful. Like, share, follow, whatever you want to do. Okay, thanks.